And with that, I'll hand it over to Yellow. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yellow Breen. I'm the president and CEO of the Maine Development Foundation. Julie Bean, who you just heard, is our logistics impresario for this whole program. It has been for a few years. And Mike Higgins, who you also see on screen, is our consulting program director who spearheads this project with Julie. So they do all the hard work. I just wanted to acknowledge them before we even get rolling. We've got a wonderful session today. I think of this as Maine Economy 101. You'll hear from me a little bit on the recently released measures of growth, which hopefully has hit both your electronic and even physical mailbox. Let us know if it hasn't. And our state economist, Amanda Rector, who I'll introduce in a little bit. I just want to go back and say MDF has been pleased to be part of this Policy Leaders Academy program since the mid-'80s. And we partner with a lot of folks on this. We could not do this without the trust placed in us by the Legislative Council. MDF is a statutorily chartered entity that was set up to work in a nonpartisan cross-sector fashion on long-term economic growth. So we are accountable to you, the legislature, in all of our work, including this. We get a ton of support from the presiding officers, from their chiefs of staff, and from the legislative staff to make sure that we're doing this right and that we're trying to navigate all the conflicts you all have as a legislature. So thank you to all of them. I'm thrilled that we have Senate President Jackson here this morning to help kick off this particular program. We could not do this without our partners, especially Maine Community Foundation and Maine Health Access Foundation, along with some occasional reimbursements from the legislature. They keep this program entirely free and also really give us a ton of great ideas about the content. And then the University of Maine system, UMaine, Educate Maine, and the Maine State Chamber have been doing a ton of legwork to help us come up with the right content for you all as well. We miss seeing everyone in person. Normally, we would have had a great in-person session during swearing in week. Normally, we'd be gearing up for a 3-day bus tour across rural Maine in the second week in January. Obviously, once the vaccines are out there in force, maybe we can resume some of that, and we look forward to it. So I can introduce the rest of the session in a second, but I know his schedule, I'm sure, is crazy. So I'd love to ask Senate President Jackson if he has a few words for us as we get going. Mr. President. Oh, Troy, you're muted.
Well, I said good morning to everyone on this cold morning. Thank you, Yellow Light, and the Maine Development Foundation for having me on this morning and for putting the Policy Leaders Academy program together. This program provides important context as lawmakers plan for the session ahead. And like I said, this is going to be a challenging one. And hopefully as soon as we get over this, maybe we can start up that tour again because we haven't seen each other for a long time now. Probably be a good, a good little respite for all of us. But it also helps get new and returning lawmakers up to speed from committees so that we can waste no time getting to work. There's no issue that will dominate the 130th Maine legislature, quite like the Maine economy and what we've gone through over the past 9 months. The COVID-19 pandemic, has devastated the health and well-being of Mainers all across the state, causing widespread collateral damage to our economy. In this session, Maine lawmakers will have to come together and partner with Maine businesses and workers to chart the path ahead. The arrival of the COVID-19 vaccine this week in Maine is definitely welcome news and provides a light at the end of this long tunnel. But it's important to remember that we're not out of the woods yet. Maine families are counting on the legislature to work with Governor Mills to help them pick up the pieces, rebuild their communities, and restart our economy. They need us to put partisanship aside and come together for the sake and health of our economic recovery. Last week, when the 2020 Measures of Growth report came out, put together by the bipartisan Maine Growth Council, we remarked on what a valuable resource this will be to help chart our path ahead. Each year, this report serves as an opportunity to take stock of where we are as a state. It's a chance to reflect on the progress that we've made in areas and where we need to make significant improvements. And the 2020 report confirms much of what we already know. Mainers are spending too much on healthcare. The cost of energy is out of control. Working families are struggling to make ends meet, and affordable housing is hard to come by. And no secret at all, our infrastructure is in bad shape. Not only what we typically refer to as roads and bridges, but obviously our broadband infrastructure. And it also recognizes the progress that we have made in areas like public preschool, high-speed internet, and with the bond package last year, health insurance coverage, and pay equity. It's still clear that we have our work cut out for us this session. And I know that Yellow will get into greater detail today when he walks us through the report. But, my point is, really very clear, and something I've tried to emphasize every time I've spoken to somebody. Every lawmaker needs to show up to the State House with a unique set of priorities. But trusted data, bipartisan reports like the measure of the growth is going to help us narrow that focus, see what's working, develop meaningful policies that solve our state's greatest challenges, and, get through some of these things that, have parted us in the past. But the stakes really couldn't be higher. And I said on swearing in day, no matter what the challenges, Mainers rise to the occasion every time. And I am confident that the Maine legislature will do that with great partners like the Maine Development Foundation and others. So with that, I want to hand it back to Yellow. Really appreciate having the opportunity. Thank you for all your work. I know that it's even more challenging now, but it's even more important now. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. President, and for you and your office's really in-depth support for pulling this off. We really appreciate it. Well, we'll get right into it. I wanted to mention that this is the second of 7 sessions that we have on the drawing board for you all. We had a fantastic session last week on what I wish I knew as a legislator. Some of you were there. The recording is available for that session, and I've asked Julie to stick that link again in the chat so that you can pull that down. Please share it. If you haven't watched it, please do. If you know colleagues who would really benefit from it. I always find nuggets of wisdom that I hope are not only helpful to legislators, but frankly helpful to any leader listening. I took away a lot of stuff from last week's session that I'm going to try to apply in my own professional life. We are recording this session, and I would say that we typically have a fantastic relationship. The press tends not to bother us on these sessions. We tend to try to create an environment where no question, no matter how dumb as they say, is off limits. But obviously freedom of access does apply. And so if anyone inquires, we work with them straight up to, be as transparent as we can about why we're doing what we're doing. And if they insist on getting more information or sitting in on the first 5 minutes, they usually get bored. But we are recording this just so you know, so that others can benefit from it. So the sessions we have on Friday coming up at the end of this week, we have 3 members, including the 2 chairs of the Governor's Economic Recovery Committee, which put out its report right before Thanksgiving. We imagine those recommendations will get quite a bit of airtime across a lot of different committees. So if you haven't already signed up, please join us or encourage colleagues to join us. Lori and Josh are citizen volunteers, so I know we're trying to help them reach as many folks as are interested as efficiently as possible so they can run their college and run their company. So please participate if you can on Friday before we all break for the holidays. We're going to have 4 sessions in January, one on the budget, both the substance of what a typical biennium Maine budget looks like, and some historical and practitioner perspective on how to try to reach consensus in that most difficult job that you all have in front of you. What's a constructive budget making process look and feel like from a historical and frontline perspective? And then 3 sessions going deep on talent, innovation, and infrastructure. So Amanda and I will touch on all 3 of those in various ways today. So will Josh, Lori, and Tae Chung on Friday. But then we'll have sessions dedicated to each one because there's a lot going on there, whether you're talking about broadband, whether you're talking about workforce training. So in these 2 sessions this week, we'll touch on a lot of things, and then we'll go deep on those 3 areas in January. So hope you can join us for any or all. Hope you'll spread the word to interested colleagues. Hope you'll take advantage of the recording if you can't be with us. Julie, I should pause. Is there anything in the chat I should know about before we do genuinely just get into substance?
Yellow, I would just add that around the holiday, around Christmas, just before or after, we'll send out the notice for the dates and times of the 4 sessions that Yellow just mentioned. So you haven't gotten anything yet, but you will within a week to 10 days.
The only thing in the chat is Senator Breen mentioned that the ERC chairs are also presenting to AFA tomorrow, 2:30 to 3:30, and that you can tune in if you'd like.
Great. Okay. I think I'm sharing screen now. Is that right? Okay, great. I'm going to let Amanda Rector, our amazing state economist and wonderful human being, do most of the heavy lifting today. But given that we do work very hard with the legislatively created and also nonpartisan Economic Growth Council to put out measures of growth, which can be a reference guide to you throughout the session and beyond, I wanted to touch on that work. You'll see a lot of similar topics covered in Amanda's presentation, especially on the workforce, the demographics, and sort of overall structure of the Maine economy. But there's a lot of things in measures of growth, including a bunch of things that aren't part of Amanda's presentation today. So I want to quickly touch on those things before turning over the bulk of the time to Amanda. So this just came out last week. We've been working all year to really try to align the measures of growth to a changing environment we're in. Just a word about the Economic Growth Council. It's a publicly created commission that has the commissioner of DECD or her representative on it, has 1 legislator from each of the 4 caucuses, and has the bulk of the members from the private sector, a diverse set of private sector leaders from business, education, labor, you name it. We like to say it's the hardest body in the state to get appointed to, because the governor, speaker, and president actually have to agree by consensus on the slate of appointments. They don't each get their own slate. So getting that consensus can sometimes be difficult. Getting their attention can be difficult given everything else on their plate. So we like to say it's an important and very difficult body to be on, and they take their work incredibly seriously. For a long time now, the Growth Council and measures of growth have been guided by this overall vision that it's not just about more jobs or higher wages for their own sake, but because those things lead to a high quality of life for all Maine people. And so you'll see if you pick up measures of growth that it really tries to be a balanced scorecard, covering some things that you might not typically expect to see in an economic report card. Things on the environment, things on community, things on health and healthcare, things on safety, and so on. And I'll touch on a few of those this morning. And that's by intent, and that's been true for a lot of years now. The table of contents, if you poke around in either the full version or the shorter executive summary, there's a 2-page layout right at the beginning that gives you all 29 of the indicators right at a glance. And I think that's really helpful. It has the trend line, it has the ratings that the council has awarded to those things. So as I said, we tracked 29 metrics this year. That's up from 27. And we set long-term benchmarks. A lot of those benchmarks were set for what we hope to achieve by 2020. And we thought about this year early on, we thought about doing the work of resetting those benchmarks. Often we set them a decade out because we know they are extremely big picture, complex issues. They take several years to begin to change the course of the aircraft carrier, as they say, let alone several years to see true progress. We did not reset those long-term benchmarks this year because we know the pandemic recession is going to reset our baseline in a lot of important and interesting ways. So the council will come back next year to reset some of those long-term aspirations. We almost always stack up how Maine does against other states and the country. So we want to make absolute progress as a state. It's not all about a competition, but partly we want to know if we're doing well on something, are we doing better than average, or are we just about average? Are we making up ground against the competition, or is it a rising tide that is lifting all boats and we're part of a national or even global trend? So this year there was a mixed bag. We saw some progress, we saw some slippage, we saw some neutral, and then as always we highlighted the gold stars and red flags, which I'll touch on in a second. New context. There's 8 extra pages in the report this year. And part of that is attempting to do what Amanda will do in a minute, which is make sure that these long-range benchmarks and long-range data insights are put in the context of what has been disrupting and impacting all Mainers and all sectors of the economy over the past 8-9 months. To put it in context of the work that all of us are doing to come face to face with the legacy of racial discrimination in the country. And the council asked us to take a hard statistical look at what we can see in that regard. The uncertainty is, of course, enormous. And then we started working earlier in the year. We had a newly released 10-year economic strategy put out last December around this time. And we met with Commissioner Johnson and began working as a council on how could we adapt the measures of growth to make sure that the content and the choice of methodology more easily aligns to the 10-year strategy. So you as policymakers and the Maine people can start to see where do we need to make progress? Are we making progress? So if you were to go back and compare this year's report to a year ago, you'll see a lot of headings that are tweaked. You'll see several metrics that are tweaked. We added some things, and we added a lot of narrative that can tie those two pieces together. Then the bottom fell out, and now we have the new work of the Economic Recovery Committee. And we tried to anticipate as best we could where they were headed as their dialogue unfolded. And again, make sure that measures of growth was something complementary that you all could use so that the new metrics and the aligned metrics matched up against those things. So in light of that, we added 2 new metrics this year. One on racial and ethnic income equity, and I'll discuss that quickly in a second. And Amanda's got some wonderful information about racial and gender equity as well. And we added pre-K education. That was a huge conversation in the 10-year plan, even before we saw how lack of access to childcare can pull parents and households out of the workforce during something like the pandemic. We knew that early care and early childhood education was crucial in the 10-year plan for a lot of those same reasons. Crucial because these are the pipeline of Maine's future in their own right, these young kids, but also crucial because this is part of the magic elixir of increasing workforce participation in Maine over time. So we revised a few metrics as noted to better match up to the 10-year plan. So you can see where we are. Maine is at a place in time where the wages for all minority race and ethnic groups in our state are only 62% of the average per capita income for white non-Hispanic workers in our state. So a 38% gap. We know that's a huge gap, and yet the council felt like, and this, by the way, the benchmark, I just caught this earlier this week, and we'll make sure that the PDF gets revised. We're not going to hit 100% parity by 2022. I think that was actually supposed to say 2030, and it was a typo that got past all of us in the proofing process, so we'll tweak that. That's a heavy lift to close that kind of gap, even over a decade or half a decade. That's a heavy lift. And it will take a lot of strategic consideration of what causes this gap. Some is education, some is systemic racism and implicit bias. There's a lot of things, both formal and informal, systematic and particular, that we all need to grapple with to do our part in closing a gap as big as this. And pre-K, we have done a lot as a state over the last decade. The supermajority of Maine school districts are offering pre-K for 4-year-olds, public free pre-K. And about half of all 4-year-olds in the state are enrolled in those public pre-K programs. Half is not enough. I think the council would really want me to reinforce that point. However, we gave this a gold star this year because we really wanted to honor the dramatic progress and the fact that we are doing so much better than peer comparisons we want to encourage policymakers to stay the course in moving this black dotted line that is Maine upwards in the coming years as well. So Amanda, as I said, is going to touch on a ton of the things that you'll see in the table of contents for measures of growth. Some of the areas that she does not touch on as much today, at least not directly, include the innovation section of measures of growth, and we'll get into that on Friday and in January. We've got several metrics. R&D spend is one of those where this has been a red flag for a lot of years. Maine is at the bottom of this comparative chart. EPSCoR, by the way, for those of you who are just getting into your funky acronyms, EPSCoR is a National Science Foundation program for additional R&D support for rural states like Maine that have low basic R&D. We are part of that group. So even compared to that group of states like us, who tend to be more sparsely populated, tend to be rural, and have fewer really heavy-duty R&D institutions, we trail that comparison point, and that's a big deal, and we'll talk more about it this month and next. Business climate is an area that, again, may be implicit in some of what Amanda will cover, but I wanted to make sure that you knew that that was part and parcel of measures of growth, and we may have opportunity to talk more about this throughout PLA as well, and there's a bunch of different metrics there. On the community side, infrastructure and health and safety. Again, I think Amanda does touch on a couple of these, including housing affordability, but there's a bunch of areas covered in measures of growth that the council deems to be really important to a holistic perspective of what's going on in the Maine economy and what affects economic outcomes for communities and individuals. We'll talk about infrastructure a lot more in a January session of PLA, and we are going to try to be working in discussions about health and health innovation throughout those several sessions as well. Safety is a gold star, not surprisingly. In this case, we're talking about crime rate comparisons where Maine is off the charts low by national standards. But obviously, this could circle back and also be about our safety when it comes to our public health response to things like COVID as well. And then finally, environment. Again, maybe not part of the traditional sort of mantra of economists, but when you talk about a balanced scorecard, if we were to pursue economic growth in a way that made our communities weaker or our environment less healthy, what would be the point anyway? And what we see actually is that these things are calling cards for Maine in terms of what attracts talent to our state and keeps talent in our state. And we'll talk more about that. Air quality is a gold star this year. I might have a graphic on that. I do. We had the healthiest year on record in 2019 when it comes to air quality. We used to talk about Maine being at the end of the tailpipe, for a lot of the factories in the Midwest. And that picture has changed dramatically over the last 20, 30 years. So a lot to celebrate there. And part of that is a national story, of course, of which Maine is a beneficiary. So I mentioned these as we went along. Pre-K safety and air quality were our gold stars this year of calling cards we can continue to promote and amplify for our state. And I think it's interesting that they touch on, our talent, our human capital here that's so important. They touch on the nature of our communities, and they touch on the nature of our environment. The red flags, and I mentioned most of these in passing as we went along, also cover those areas. How are we doing in terms of our workforce? How are we doing in terms of innovation? How are we doing in terms of business climate? And how are we doing in terms of making sure that economic prosperity is accessible to all, and all Mainers are helping to shape a vision of what that prosperity is like? I'll say these are hard issues. We're doing a lot of internal work at MDF to, we just had an entire afternoon yesterday as a staff to grapple with our understanding of what diversity, inclusion, and equity mean. It's not about judging anyone. It's not about blaming anyone for the past. It's about figuring out a common base of understanding of what we can change going forward. So that's a rollicking tour of Measures of Growth 2020. I think our game plan is to stop for 5 or 10 minutes to take questions on that. And I'll be sticking around throughout to take questions at the end alongside Amanda if anything relevant comes up. So let me pause, and then I can't wait to turn it over to our amazing state economist. I'll stop sharing, and I guess there's a question or two in the chat, and I'll take a look at those while anyone else gathers their thoughts. Thanks. Yeah, Representative Barry has a comment about, the 0 to 3 part before we pick up those kids in typical public pre-K programs for 4 and 5-year-olds. That's absolutely right. I think we were disappointed as a council that there wasn't more data available about the early care piece. Some of you have wrestled with this issue even more than I have. Know that we have some decent data on what tends to be known as center-based childcare, but of course there are a lot of small providers in the state at different ends of the licensing continuum, and a lot of informal, what used to be known as kith and kin care. I don't even know if that's still the term of art today. And so getting a handle on what's really going on with 0 to 3-year-olds is very hard, as Representative Barry points out. So we would love to augment the early education metric with a true early care and early development metric over time, for sure, for all the reasons stated there. I don't know, Representative Barry or anyone else, if you have an additional amplification on that question.
No, that's great, Yellow. I really appreciate all the work you guys are doing on early childhood. I'd love to see us really focus on that 0 to 3 piece. And I think a lot of it is just supporting families, young families who are, trying to make it work. They all, every parent wants the best for their kid. It's just, it's really hard for some to be able to provide that. So, I think it is sometimes hard to measure these things, but I do wonder about data from pediatricians and Maine's wonderful home visitors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Seth. I appreciate it. Another question in the chat is about the cost of business being 10% higher. There's several different elements in the cost of doing business, and then we actually portray most of those separately in the report. So cost of labor related factors in the economy, certainly cost of facilities when it comes to industrial, warehouse, you name it, cost of energy. Those are all part of that overall cost of doing business. And when you break those down, Maine tends to have, even though our wages are low, we tend to have pretty high overall labor costs in Maine. Part of that is that health costs in Maine are higher, and you can see that breakdown. The cost of health insurance in our state is high. We have some high incidence of cancers and other high cost illnesses, some preventable or reducible, some not. So, when you think about labor, unfortunately, it's not just what we pay ourselves that can drive that cost up. Not surprisingly, cost of facilities tends to be low on a relative scale. It's not that hard to find a reasonably priced place to put a business in this state from a physical location point of view. And then cost of energy is a mixed bag. It tends to be much lower in Maine. And we're talking about, industrial energy prices as delivered, okay, all in. Those prices in Maine tend to be far lower than Southern New England, but far higher than the national average. So it's really important as a policymaker, when you are hearing constituents or colleagues or lobbyists tell you something is high or low, always be careful to ask them, compared to what? And what's the trend line? Something can be high, but progressing in a nice way. Historically, something can be low, but headed in the wrong direction. If you delve into the detail on housing affordability in Maine, for instance, you can see that our housing affordability has tended to be better than some of the points of comparison, but getting slightly and gradually worse, which is troubling, right? So always be asking, compared to what, and what's the trend line? And I think, I suspect Amanda would agree with that. So the question then is, what can we compete for? Our challenge, and I won't get into a lot of the implications too deep today, because we could go all day on any one of them. But if you take something like the cost of energy, the challenge tends to be that when it comes to energy intensive businesses like manufacturing, and some of our natural resource manufacturers like pulp and paper. Unfortunately, there's none of those left in Southern New England. So when we say, hey, we're cheaper than Southern New England, that's great, but that may not be the locations that we're competing against for that particular sector. We're competing against the Great Lakes states, we're competing against the American South, we're competing against Canada, Indonesia, Brazil, right? So I think it's compared to who, and for that given investment, who are we competing against? And then one of the reasons we really tend to focus on New England for a lot of other things is that when it comes to talent, when it comes to intellectual property-based businesses, when it comes to innovation-based businesses, there we definitely do feel that we're competing against Southern New England pretty heavily. And so we need to make sure we have a good enough workforce and a welcoming environment for innovation type of investments that will compete favorably there. So there's 3 or 4 different things packed into cost of doing business. There was a nice trend line there for a while. Now it's starting to get slightly worse again. So we wanted to keep an eye on it. And then Rachel Talbot Ross has some nice comments about the racial equity issue. And we are trying to make sure there's a healthy discussion point on this in every single session that we offer in January. And I know that Lori, Josh, and Tay is a passionate spokesperson for not only the challenge, of growing up as an Asian American in Portland, but also the opportunity that, serving the markets and the stakeholders in Maine who are either longtime or newer racial or ethnic groups, and serving those markets across the country, the tremendous opportunity. So I hope you'll hear that it's not only a serious, urgent, challenge and pain point for us as a state that we all need to share in working on, but it's also a tremendous opportunity for the state. One of the things that magnifies the kind of a comment that you're making, Rachel, is, the history is important, because when you see the metrics around income that I presented a few minutes ago, or the metrics around the wealth disparity between ethnic and racial groups in our society in America, a lot of those are the product of everything that happened, let's say from 1619 to 1970. And so despite all the things we may have been doing or trying to do to chip away, there's a compounding effect of all that went before that we all have to recognize and work hard to unravel and get to a different place. So the history is very important, as Rachel says. All right, I think I'll take one last skim through that on the chat, and I won't try to answer every single question today, because in terms of the R&D, maybe Amanda can touch on this. I know she's been part of the dialogue, and maybe that's a good segue to you, Amanda. As a state, we've often looked at jurisdictions, whether it be the Research Triangle in North Carolina, whether it be some of the work that Ireland did over the years, whether it's been other states and nations. We're not the same as any one of those jurisdictions, but I think the common elements that I hear a lot are you have to have a really long-term vision and persistence in that vision. And that vision has to be widely shared across public sector, NGO, and private sector actors. I think we've got the building blocks. MTI has done a fantastic job. They're a powerful representation on those boards and those subject matter committees that they have. There are emerging in Maine over the past few years, and even this year, a lot of groups. We've been supporting one called the Forest Opportunity Roadmap, which is a group trying to leverage industry, community, and R&D leadership at the university to pursue those bioproducts, biofuels, biomaterials, you name it, bioplastics. In that space, there's a newly formed group that is trying to pursue, those commercializable and over-the-horizon opportunities in the marine economy. There's a group trying to do that for agriculture, and there's a group trying to do that for offshore wind. So I think even over the last couple of years, we've hit on some even more deliberate approaches to trying to bring industry, university, and community leadership together. If we pursue amazing opportunities, and there's not the workforce or the community commitment to be host communities for those sorts of opportunities, it won't work, right? So I think we're getting even better at this in recent years, would be my short answer to the question on R&D. Someone cautions the acronyms, you will encounter a million of them. MTI is the Maine Technology Institute, legislatively created by you all, funded by you all, both through general fund and bond issues over the years. Some of their funding kind of rolls forward from year to year, which is nice, but some doesn't. So there are a lot of important actors. I was sensing we have to put a glossary of terms together for our own board of directors at MDF sometimes. So don't hesitate to ask. I would just say this, I've never been a legislator, but as I've entered lots of new organizations or new sectors over the course of my career, if you're willing to ask the dumb question, it's amazing how much you can learn. And it's amazing how much you figure out that 2/3 of the people at the table had the same question and were just afraid to be the first one to ask it. So I think that goes in spades. Everyone in Maine wants to help you do the best you can at being a great public servant and a good policymaker. So ask in your public sessions, ask people in your districts. If you get a chance to either tour or virtually tour any type of facility, the amazing power you have is that anyone will want to have you. So I will stop talking. Amanda Rector, I've known Amanda for at least 16 years, maybe more, she'll correct me. I think you have her bio. She's been the state economist for what, about a decade now, Amanda? You know, she's a wonderful Maine asset. And I'll let her take it away, and her presentation always engenders a ton of questions. Amanda, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Terrific. Thank you, Yellow. And thank you to all of you for your service to the people of Maine. I really appreciate it. I'm Amanda Rector. I'm coming to you this morning from the lovely but somewhat chilly town of Union. I have, as Yellow said, been the state economist for almost a decade now, which is very hard for me to believe. It has gone very quickly, never a dull moment, this year in particular. So my task this morning is to give you an overview of the Maine economy. It is always really challenging to put this kind of a presentation together, because I want you to know everything, and you don't really want to sit there and listen to me talk for 3 hours. So I have to pare down, and particularly this presentation, because I'm trying to give you not just sort of the baseline overview of the economy, but also a sense of what things have been like over the course of this year and what has changed. So I'm going to start out today with some demographics. I always talk about demographics first. You really have to understand who the people of the state are to understand the economy of the state. I talk about employment, income, and then state gross domestic product, or GDP. Starting out with demographics, this is the really long-term view of Maine's population, going all the way back to 1820. You can see we've had some periods of more rapid growth in the state's history, and then some periods of slower growth. And more recently, we've been in one of those slower growth periods. The population estimate for 2019, 1,344,212. That makes Maine the 42nd largest state in the US. We are anxiously awaiting the results of the 2020 decennial census. I hope everyone made sure to participate and get themselves counted. We should have those numbers soon, but in the meantime, we are left with this population estimate. The projections here are demographic projections that are a couple of years old at this point. They're based on 2016 data. I'm in the process of getting those updated, but I got a little sidetracked with some other things that were happening this year. So they're a little behind schedule. We're hoping to have those wrapped up soon. But the projections here for not a lot of growth, sort of just holding steady. We did see some population change. We saw an increase of 1.2% in the Maine's population from 2010 to 2019. That was actually 40th in the US. And I listed the states that we are ahead of because it's kind of an interesting group. There are some of our New England neighbors there, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, but there are some larger states that you might not think of as us having higher population growth. New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. So if we look at the racial mix and ethnic mix of the state's population, only about 7% of the state's population identifies as a race or ethnicity other than white non-Hispanic. The bulk of the population in the state is white non-Hispanic. So that racial diversity and ethnic diversity is the lowest in the US, but we have been seeing some improvements. And in fact, if we look at the contribution to overall population growth in the state for 2010 to 2019, that 1.2% increase, most of that population growth is actually coming from the races other than white. So Black or African American, almost 38% of the growth, 2 or more races, almost 31%, Asian, 21.5%. So without that increasing diversity in our state, we really would not have seen the population growth that we did see. It's a really important part of the state population growth recently, and that increasing diversity in the state is a very important part of increasing diversity of thought and diversity of the economy as well. Now, median age, I'm sure everyone knows that Maine is the oldest state in the country. We're actually the oldest state in the country by 2 different measures, median age and percent of the population age 65 and older. So if we look across the state, the line in this chart shows the statewide median, about 45 years. There are a couple of counties that stand out as having a median age considerably higher than the state's median, Lincoln County and Piscataquis County. Piscataquis is the oldest. Both of those actually have median ages above 50 years. There are a few counties that come in below the median. Androscoggin's the youngest, Cumberland and Penobscot, and then Kennebec just squeaks in under that line. York is just over the line down at the other end there. Those 4 counties have a couple things in common. They have our larger cities or the urban areas of the state, at least as urban as we get here in Maine. And they also have some pretty good sized college populations. And so those things bring in a larger, more youthful population to offset the larger baby boom population. And that is, in fact, not coincidentally, another area we lead in is we have the highest share of baby boomers here in Maine of any state in the US. So baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964, this is a population pyramid for the state of Maine for 1950. So each of those bars represents the percent of the population in a particular age sex cohort. And it is shaped kind of like a pyramid, hence the name. So if you look at the bottom of this pyramid, baby boomers in 1950 were just starting to be born. They were all under the age of 5. So this is a very, very wide base. That under 5 age cohort was the largest age cohort in 1950 in Maine. Up at the top of the pyramid, not a lot of people living beyond the age of 85. So that top piece is very narrow. If I jump ahead through a few decades here, you'll notice that there's this bulge in the population that is moving upwards. So I'm going to pause at 2010 for a second because this is the most recent decennial data that we had. If you look at the very top of the pyramid, you'll notice that that has been expanding over time. Life expectancies have increased as we've gone along. So there have been more people accumulating up at the top of the pyramid. There's that large bulge of the baby boomers that in 2010, we're still mostly in working age years, but just starting to nudge into what we think of as sort of traditional retirement years. And then there's another smaller bulge down near the bottom of the pyramid here, and that's essentially the children of the baby boomers. Even though birth rates themselves are lower for the baby boomers than they were for the baby boomers' parents. The sheer number of baby boomers meant that when they had kids, there was another bulge in the population that appeared. And that's essentially the millennial generation. So if we jump ahead a little bit, that's the 2019 population estimate. And then the 2026 population projection, which, as I said, it's a little outdated now, but you get the general idea here, which is essentially we are turning our population pyramid upside down. We're seeing more and more of the baby boomers move into their retirement years and accumulating up near the top of this pyramid, and we have not had the in-migration over the decades of the younger population offset that aging of the baby boomers. So if we look at the components of population change, we've reached a point in the past decade, for most of the past 10 years, where we have something called natural population decline. So we have more deaths than births in the state in any given year. If that were the only thing making up population change, Maine's population would have shrunk, because more deaths than births, negative population change. Of course, people move too. So we look at the migration, and if you'll see there are two different migration pieces here. The light blue is international migration. That's people moving into Maine directly from other parts of the world. And that is positive. It's a really small number. It's been particularly small 2017 through 2019. The dark blue is domestic migration. So that's people moving in and out of the state from other parts of the country. If somebody were to move from another part of the world to a different part of the US and then to Maine, they would be captured in domestic migration rather than in international migration. Domestic migration was actually negative at a couple points earlier in the decade. So there were more people moving out of Maine than in, and you can see there were actually a couple of points where the population shrank, 2012 and 2015, the population actually declined year over year. More recently, we've seen domestic migration increase and more people moving into the state than out. And that has increased by a little bit more each year of the past few years, so that it's been more than enough to offset the natural decline that we're seeing. So we're ending up with some overall net population increase. Now, more recently, are we seeing some migration effects from COVID? Well, Maine has been seen as a safer place to be in recent months, particularly over the summer, due to lower case counts and infection rates, lower population density. That lower population density may prove increasingly attractive to people in the coming months and years. And the ability to work remotely is making it easier for people to consider a move to Maine, especially if high-speed internet access improves. So in terms of that remote work, this is a chart coming from the Opportunity Insights Economic Tracker. They're looking at some Google mobility data. This is one of the new data sets that became available as we were all waiting for our traditional data sets to catch up to what was happening so quickly over the spring and summer. So this looks at time spent outside the home, and this is for Maine specifically. And you can see that we saw this really sharp decline in time spent outside the home in March into April, and then a bit of a gain. This is the dark blue line, a bit of a gain that went through to about July. We almost made it back up to January levels in late September, early October, and then that started to decline again as the weather got a little bit colder. Case counts started to rise. People have been spending more time back at home again. The light blue line here is time spent outside the home, specifically at the workplace. So that fell really, really sharply in March. And while it did come back up, it has not come up anywhere near the levels that it had been previously, and stays well below. We're about 20% below where we were in January. And so there are still a lot of people who are either not working or are working from home. We have already seen an influx of home buyers from out of state. If you look at this chart here, this is single family existing home sales on a monthly basis, looking at the percent change from a year ago. So there's a lot of noise in this. It's hard to see through that sometimes, but the general trend recently, you can see there was a big decline when the early months of COVID hit and people were staying home. Home sales declined a lot on a year-over-year basis, and then rose very, very sharply. Maine Realtors noted in their November press release, October 2020 home sales are up almost 27% compared to October 2019. Along with that is a 24.5% increase in the median sale price. Now, normally out-of-state buyers represent about 25% of sales. In October, they were actually 36% of sales. So we are seeing a larger influx of people from out of state. While some of those have indicated that they might be second homes or temporary, there are others who have indicated that they are in fact planning a permanent move to Maine. We don't have a lot of detail yet about exactly who these people are, how long they're going to stay. Are these retirement age couples? Are they younger families? But the hope is that this might increase some of the migration into the state and help to, particularly if they're younger families, help to offset some of that aging baby boomer trend that we have been seeing. Now, the downside of this, of course, is that even before this happened, that really sharp increase in home prices, there were a lot of places in the state where households are unable to afford the median home. And so the home availability and affordability piece of this is very concerning. The red counties here, mostly along the southern and coastal portions of the state, are considered unaffordable. The percent of households unable to afford the median home would be the 50th percentile home, that those percentages are higher than 50%. A lot of the more recent home sales we've seen have been in some of those more rural counties. So the ones that are currently in green, it could potentially start nudging those up into some of this unaffordable territory. So this is something to pay very close attention to and make sure that it doesn't become even more of a serious issue than home availability and affordability already is. Let me grab a breath here for a moment before I shift gears to employment. Were there any pressing questions that came up in the demographic section?
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you want to comment on whether or not you see this trend? I mean, whether or not this trend is specifically COVID related, the increase in out-of-state people coming in, I mean, it's a significant increase in purchasing homes. And if it's COVID related, do you see it continuing? I'm just wondering if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that is one of the very significant questions that we've been thinking about. I do think that a lot of it is definitely COVID related. There are a lot of people, particularly in more densely populated urban areas, who, with the shift to remote work, suddenly had the opportunity to move to a place that maybe they had wanted to move to and didn't have to then find a new job. They could keep working at the same job. So I think that the question is going to be, how many people decide that they really do like the lifestyle change coming to Maine and decide that that's something that they want to continue. And how many people decide that, you know, after a year or two, maybe they actually really miss the big city and want to go back there. You know, certainly, while I love Maine and would like everybody to love Maine as much as I do, there are some people that are just not cut out for life in Maine. And so I am sympathetic to the people like my brother who live in the city and don't really have any interest in living in Maine. I think that we're trying to figure out what that trend will be in the long term, and it's still a little too early to have a good sense of it. So unless there is something else, I will move into the employment section.
Amanda, I wondered if I could ask a question about, do we have any sense of the age range of the people that have been moving into Maine since the COVID
not yet.
started?
Not yet. We're still hoping to find some more information on that. I think a lot of it we're going to have to wait, at least for official data, we're going to have to wait until we get we might capture some of it in the decennial census count, but for some of it, we might have to wait until the estimates come out the following year. There are lots of anecdotes about, I've heard anecdotes about both sides, about lots of retirees who are maybe extending their summers, if not fully year round, well into the shoulder seasons. But I've also heard stories about families that are coming here with their kids. And so I don't have a good sense yet of exactly what the age mix is.
Stepping back into the affordability issue on home prices, what are your suggestions for policy solutions to the home affordability issue?
Yeah, I would say you'll I think probably hear more about this on Friday from Josh and Lori, because that was one of the issues that the Economic Recovery Committee was looking at. And it was an issue in the 10-year plan as well. So I think that there are a couple of other resources. I would, rather than take time now, I would direct you towards those as a good starting point to start thinking about some of those. I think my hope was to whet your appetite for that and to make sure that you're aware of the issue.
Amanda, yes. Representative Pebworth has a question in the chat about the number of buyers from out of state, and she's wondering what accounts for the increase from in-state buyers.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would think that in part, some of it may be a moving from one place to another. Like if you're in state, you're selling your house to somebody from out of state, you're then buying a house somewhere else in state. There may be an increase in people who are buying a second home in state. I don't have a lot of detail around sort of the nitty gritty of all of the separate movements that are going on. Some of it may be people who decided to move to a different part of the state. Maybe they had been down in the greater Portland area and saw this as an opportunity to sell their home there at a very high price to one of those people moving in from out of state and move to a more rural location, because we have seen some increased sales in some of the more disparate parts of the state. All right. Julie, was there anything else, or should I go ahead to employment now?
Yeah, you can go ahead now.
Okay. So I'm going to start out again with a nice big long-term picture. This is Maine's total labor force. Of course, one of the reasons that demographics are so important is because the people that you have in your state are going to, by and large, make up your available labor force. Now, some of that is actually, if remote work stays as prevalent as it is now, some of that could actually change, because you could be an employer in Maine and employ people all over the country or the world without having to have them relocate to Maine. But for most things, you're still going to get the bulk of your labor force from within the state. So if we look at the total labor force, you'll see this goes all the way back to 1947 in this chart. You'll see this very rapid period of growth in the middle of the chart. We added about 50,000 people to the labor force every 6 years from the mid to late 60s up through about just shy of 1990. And so what was happening here was sort of a perfect storm of a few different elements. We had the baby boomers coming of age and entering the workforce in large numbers. We had some good migration into the state, primarily of baby boomers, and we had women joining the labor force in much higher shares than they had previously. So then we had a period where we added about 50,000 to the labor force every 9 years. The growth slowed a little bit. And then we hit 2005 and labor force growth pretty much stalled out, and we've started to actually trend downward now. And the biggest factor contributing to that is that aging of the baby boom generation and the fact that we don't have the population in the younger age cohorts to offset that. If you think back to those population pyramids, those are really driving this labor force trend. Now, more recently in the past few months, we have seen, so women still have lower labor force participation rates overall than men do. We've seen a really troubling gap opening up. So the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas came out with this study. They published it just last month, looking at some different labor force participation rates for different demographic groups. And so this looks at prime age labor force participation rates. That's 25 to 54 years. That's sort of what we think of as your prime age working years for women and for men. And you can see that both women and men saw a big decline that came in March and April, and then again through June. But since June, while the labor force participation rate for men has held fairly steady, this is a national, I should mention, this is a national chart, not Maine specific data. But there's no reason to think that the Maine specific data would not show us something different, or would show us something. I have not had enough coffee to use that many negatives in a sentence. The Maine data should be the same as the national data. The rate for men has not changed really over that period. It's held pretty steady, but the rate for women has actually declined. So we've opened up a gap even more for labor force participation rates between men and women. So why is this happening? Well, we'll also note that in Maine specifically, 52% of households with children under age 18 present reported a loss of employment income since March, compared to 38% of households without children. So you'll remember schools and childcare were disrupted and many children were suddenly home all day. Somebody had to be home with the children. Traditionally in the United States, women are the ones who stay home with the kids. And that actually was what we saw happen, was that the person who had to stay home with the kids was the woman in the household. So they left the labor force to care for children. So for women to re-enter the labor force, not only do they need to have a job to return to, they also need to have safe, reliable, in-person school or childcare available. This trend is very troubling, and this goes back to some of the childcare issues that Yellow was talking about earlier. And it is not just the pre-K and the K through 12, but it is perhaps even more so the 0 to 3, because somebody really needs to be home caring for the youngest children. So we really saw some challenges in the labor force participation rates. If we look at the unemployment rates, you look at this chart without that last line, sort of that really big spike at the end of it. When we entered 2020, unemployment rates were some of the lowest on record. And then in April of 2020, unemployment rates were the highest on record and rose more than in any other month. But even so, they still underrepresented what the true unemployment rate would be due to some technical issues. Some of those were related to the administering the survey and survey responses, but a big portion of that was the fact that all of those people who had left the labor force for various reasons, including to care for children, were not being counted as unemployed. They were being counted as out of the labor force. So the Department of Labor is doing some estimation around what the unemployment rate would be if labor force participation were at normal levels. So the official unemployment rate in October of this year was 5.4%. If labor force participation were at normal levels, the unemployment rate would probably be 9.3%. So if we look at employment, the history on here, you can see we have the pre-Great Recession peak back in 2007. Then we saw what we thought was a really big decline in employment going through to 2010, and then gradual growth until we hit 2016. And we finally made it back to that pre-Great Recession employment peak, and then built on that for a few years. And then we hit a new peak in 2019, 636,000. Now, the state has a consensus revenue forecasting process. The first part of that process is an official economic forecast that is put together by the Consensus Economic Forecasting Commission, or CEFC. So they normally meet twice a year. It's 5 independent economists. They cannot be part of state government or the legislature. They need to have experience with the economics and analytics and forecasting. So that group normally meets twice a year to set the official forecast. They met for a February 1st report and then quickly realized that that forecast was not going to hold up. And so they met again for an off-cycle forecast for July 1st, where they updated their forecast. And then they met for their normal statutory update for November 1st forecast. So this is from their November 1st employment forecast. That's one of the indicators that they forecast that is then used to feed into the models for the revenue forecasting. I sit on the revenue forecasting committee. And of course, the revenue forecast in turn tells us what we have available for the state budget. So this is the first very important step in that process. So our current forecasted trough is this year, it's 585,000. Now that averages across the whole year. So even though we've gained some since our lows back in April, it's looking at an annual forecast. And then their forecast is coming up pretty sharply next year, about 608,000, and then another pretty good year of growth in 2022. And then essentially really, really minimal growth going forward. And that's related to a trend that they've had for several years now, where they're looking at our demographics and saying we just don't have the younger population entering the workforce to be able to see a lot of employment growth going forward. Now, this is actually a little bit more optimistic in the out years because they have not completely flatlined that. They did add a little bit of growth back into those 2023, 24, 25 years, looking at the increased migration that we've seen because of some of the remote work and the increased interest in Maine as a place of residence. And so they're hopeful that we'll be able to see that continue. But you'll notice that that line is well below what the peak employment was in 2019. And some of that is an expectation that there will be people who were nearing retirement who have maybe accelerated their retirement due to COVID-related reasons. If we look at employment by industry, the industry that makes up most of Maine's employment is trade, transportation, and utilities, primarily retail trade. Retail trade has actually been declining in employment in recent years as we buy more things online, so that trend is likely to continue. We may see the chart change at some point in the next few years where healthcare and social assistance, which is the next largest, becomes the largest employer industry. Government is the third largest, and that includes federal, state, and local, and it includes all of the public education system, which is why that is such a large employer in the state. Leisure and hospitality and professional and business services are next. Professional and business services has been increasing quite dramatically in recent years, becoming more and more of a player in Maine's economy. Manufacturing still makes up more than 8% of Maine's employment. And then we have some of the smaller industry, financial activities, construction, other services, educational services, that's just private education, and then information and mining and logging. If we look at the sectors and think about what has been happening in recent months, the impacts to employment and the recoveries have been very uneven. So some sectors and jobs were less impacted, jobs that could easily transition to remote work. I was in the office one day and I packed up my laptop and some paperwork and worked from home the next. And it was essentially a seamless transition, very easy for me to make that transition to remote work. There were some sectors that were related to pandemic response and some of the increased migration and time spent at home. So some parts of manufacturing, some parts of retail, particularly some of the larger stores where they were able to add workers to help with some of the new safety measures and extra cleaning, things like that were going on. Some of the smaller retail, some of the boutique stores have seen employment decline or have closed entirely. Construction has been expanding dramatically, as you might imagine, when we're all stuck at home and there are a lot of people moving into the state and buying homes, moving around the state and buying homes. Construction is in great demand, and healthcare, some parts of healthcare as well, clearly related to pandemic response. Then there are some industries that were more highly impacted. High touch jobs, face-to-face interactions are frequent. Some of the activities reliant on large gatherings, movie theaters, arts venues, sectors tied to tourism. They have been really, really hard hit. If we look at employment data on a monthly basis without adjusting for seasonality, we can actually start to see some of these differences. So first, the big picture, this is total private employment on a monthly basis, not seasonally adjusted. So you can see that big seasonality in the state's economy. July and August are sort of our peak months, with January, February being, March, sort of the doldrums of employment in Maine. If you can look at the first 2 months there, January and February, we actually started out 2020 in great shape. We were even higher than we had been in 2019, which was higher than 2018, higher than 2017 in terms of employment. Again, we saw a really big decline in April, some pretty sharp gains in May and June as some of the things that were easily reopenable came back online. And then we saw a little bit more growth, sort of that seasonal bump, but that seasonal bump is now starting to unwind a little bit. October and September were pretty much at the same level. If we look at government employment, this is sort of funny because it looks like a very reverse seasonal trend. And that's, of course, because the public education system is part of this. And July and August, teachers and people in school are generally not working. And so we were only a little bit below those sort of July and August lows for this sector, but that decline, instead of all happening between June and July, was spread out through March all the way down through July. And it came back in September as usual, but not anywhere near to the same level that it normally is. So clearly there are still some issues around employment in this particular sector. Construction, I mentioned earlier, saw a little bit of a decline in April, but then came right back in May and has been up above the 2019 employment levels pretty strongly since then. Lots of demand for this sector right now. Retail trade, again, big decline in April, came back and is pretty much right back on trend now. As I said, there's been some change in the mix of employment in this sector, but still it come back pretty strongly. On the other hand, leisure and hospitality has been very, very hard hit. And it did still see that little bit of a seasonal bump, but the seasonal bump brought it back up to where it normally is in January and February, which is sort of those are the lowest months. Normally, it's considerably higher than that in those months, and we've started to see employment in this sector decline again since August. Healthcare and social assistance. Now, you would think that in the middle of a pandemic, healthcare and social assistance employment would be very, very high. We started the year out very high and then really declined in April. And that was a combination of a few different things. So part of that, if you think about some of the other offices besides hospitals that are included in healthcare and social assistance, things like dentist offices and some of the specialists, a lot of those were closed. So we saw some really rapid gains when those opened back up again, but we're still well below. And the other piece of this is, of course, childcare is part of this employment industry. So there are still a lot of employment challenges related to that. In part, a lot of the people who work in childcare are often women with children of their own who may not have been able to go back to work because they were home caring for their children who didn't have available school or childcare of their own. So still well below the typical trend for employment in healthcare and social assistance. This is national data on employment by occupation across a few different racial and ethnic groups. The challenge with getting Maine-specific data is that because our population has such small shares of Black, African American, Asian, and other races and ethnicities beyond white non-Hispanic, the data is just, it has huge margins of error, and it is very, very hard to come by. In many cases, they won't even publish it. But I do think that it's important to look at this because it gives you a sense of the fact that there is some disparity in the types of jobs that people with different racial and ethnic backgrounds are holding. So if you look at Black or African American and Hispanic or Latino ethnicity compared to white, Black or African American and Hispanic or Latino have much higher shares of employment in service occupations. If you think back across the industries that we looked at just now and the slide that I shared about the types of jobs that were harder hit, a lot of those really hard hit jobs are in service occupations. And so people who are of different race and ethnic backgrounds were hit much, much harder depending on what occupation they were working in. So nationwide, Black, Indigenous, people of color have seen higher rates of employment income loss since March relative to the white alone non-Hispanic. So white alone non-Hispanic, 42% of households reported experiencing a loss of employment income since March, either for themselves or for a household member. And then down below, you can see that compares to 55% for Black alone, 48% for Asian, 56% for 2 or more races and other races, and 60% for Hispanic or Latino. So a lot of that is related to the types of work that people were doing, and that really varies based on racial and ethnic backgrounds. There's also a disparity in terms of age. So the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston did an analysis, and they found that in July in Maine, the age cohort that had the highest unemployment insurance claimant rate as a share of the workforce by age was age 22 to 24, followed by age 25 to 34. So what's going on? Well, part of that is that those younger people tend to be working in some of those harder hit jobs and tend to have those young kids who need to be cared for when education and childcare is unavailable outside of the home. What the result of all this is that employment is beginning to look like a K-shaped recovery. So in late September, low wage employment was around 25% below January levels, while high wage employment was nearly 12% higher and middle wage was about 4% higher. And so you can really see if you are looking at this, this is incredibly troubling because the people who were doing well before the pandemic and before the recession are doing fine. They're doing well. Now, clearly that's painting a very broad brush, and on an individual level, there are people who are doing better and worse at all of these different wage levels. But if you look at the groups as a whole, the people who were doing well are doing well now, and the people who were doing worse have gotten absolutely hammered by this recession. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. This is a pre-recession chart, but this comes from the Maine Department of Labor's Employment Outlook. It was published recently, but it is based on 2018 baseline data. But it gives you a sense of the industries that are projected to gain the largest number of jobs in the future: ambulatory healthcare services, food services and drinking places, hospitals. Clearly, as the population ages, there is an increased demand for healthcare. This chart here talks about occupations with the fastest projected rate of job growth. Now, these are in some cases very small base numbers, so you're adding a lot of growth to a small number of jobs, solar photovoltaic installers, for example. But what's really interesting is that if you look across these, and a lot of these are related to those highest growth industries on the previous chart, a lot of them are in healthcare, they require some type of education beyond just a high school diploma. If we look at the percent of the population with a bachelor's degree or higher, Maine has been increasing over time. We've caught up to the US. We had been lagging behind the US for a while, but we're still well below New England. And if you look at the percent of the population with a graduate or professional degree, we're still lagging the US a little bit, but we're lagging New England by even more here. Now, where we may be able to make up some gains in terms of giving people some additional training is looking at this population that has some college but no degree. And certainly for Maine, we've got almost 20% of the adult population has some college but no degree. So that's a potential pool that could be trained further for some of those faster growing occupations in the future. Let me see how we're doing. Oh boy, I got to talk faster here. Let me run through income and GDP, and then we'll see if there are time for a few questions at the very end. Of course, educational attainment and income are very closely correlated. So this is not surprising that Maine's median household income runs below that of the US and well below that of New England. If we look at the percent of the population below poverty level, Maine is actually better than the US here, but we're not as good as New England. Now, this data set suffers from some sampling issues on occasion. So 2018 had some very strange results when the data came out. And 2019 seems to be much more in line with what we had been seeing in previous years. So I've been more inclined to try to consider 2018 as almost just a blip in the data. You can see New England looked like it spiked and then came back down. It probably didn't really spike. It just had something to do with the particular sample that year. If we look at median household income for Maine across the different racial and ethnic groups, again, you can see that if you think back to the types of jobs that different racial and ethnic groups are holding, the jobs that they tend to hold tend to have lower wages paid. So unsurprisingly, if you look at the median household income for white alone, not Hispanic or Latino, it is higher than the median household income for Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, Hispanic or Latino. Now, some of these have the black bars on here are the error bars that go along with the estimates. So it gives you a sense of that there's a lot of uncertainty in some of those particular estimates. But overall, it gives you a sense of the trend of some of those disparities that do exist here in Maine across the different racial and ethnic groups. And Yellow talked about that earlier as well. And again, women's earnings as a percent of men's earnings, the bar on the left there is for all occupations. We're running about 73, 74%. Holds pretty steady across most of the occupations, with the production, transportation, and material moving occupations where women tend to be less represented, actually having also lower earnings relative to men's in that particular occupation as well. we look instead of at sort of individual or household income and look at the total personal income for the state, the line down on the bottom here, 2019, these are the major components of personal income. 44% of income for the state of Maine came from wages and salaries in 2019, 21% from personal current transfer receipts, and I've got more detail on that in a second, but essentially that's money that gets transferred from the government to an individual. 18% dividends, interest, and rent, 11% supplements to wages and salaries, that's the benefits package that goes along with your wage and salary, and then 7% non-farm proprietors income. If you look up at 2020 Q2, that's the bar just above it, only 37% of income came from wages and salaries, and the table up in the corner gives the second quarter percent change from the first quarter on an annualized basis. So a 28%, almost 29% decline in wages and salaries in the second quarter. 32% came from personal current transfer receipts. Personal current transfer receipts increased 615% in the second quarter. That is astonishing, and I never talk about percentages that large. So what happened, if you look at the components of transfer receipts, normally, so 2019, 36% was Social Security, 25% Medicare, 19% Medicaid. If you look at the second quarter, 22% was Social Security, 16% was Medicare, 16% was Medicaid. Those didn't decline. What happened was that we added a ton of unemployment insurance compensation. So that went from about 1% to 12%. And then we added a lot of other transfer receipts. If you think back to the stimulus checks that were sent out, those ended up in all other transfer receipts. So this became a much, much larger share of income for the state as a whole this year. If we look at the forecast from the Consensus Economic Forecasting Commission, you end up with this very strange picture where wage and salary declines in 2020, but total personal income grows. And that's because those transfer receipts were more than enough to offset the decline in wages and salaries. Next year, wages and salaries come back, but all of those transfer receipts unwind, and we don't have the same level of stimulus and support coming from the federal government specifically, but also from some of the unemployment programs. So that shifts, and there's not enough of the wage and salary growth to offset all of that unwinding. So total personal income is actually forecast to decline next year before they both come back up to sort of more normal trends. So state GDP, really quickly, a couple slides here. Unsurprisingly, just as we have a gap in household income between Maine and the US, we have a gap in per capita real total GDP. We actually have, we had a gap for a while. Maine basically did not change from 2004 to 2014. We were right at 40,000. So now we've started to grow again, but we have increased that gap between Maine and the US. We can also look at Maine's value added. This is sort of a proxy for productivity. We calculate this as real GDP divided by the total full-time and part-time employment. So it's sort of how much GDP is each job producing. And Maine's running about 74% of the nation right now. And you can see 2010, 2011, it was around 77, 75%. So it's come down a little bit from about a decade ago. GDP by industry, the largest one here is finance, insurance, and real estate, and that's a little misleading. It's mostly real estate, and that includes things like imputed rent, which is if you were a homeowner and renting your house to yourself, what would you be collecting in rent? So it's a little bit different from what the normal industries are, but just to the right of that, you'll see professional and business services, and I mentioned earlier, that's been a really strongly growing sector in Maine's economy. A little bit over, two more over from that is healthcare and social assistance, which also has been continuing to grow over time. If we look at the second quarter, you can see really big declines, about 34% decline in the second quarter for Maine. The industry sectors that contributed the most to that decline, not surprisingly, accommodation and food services and healthcare and social assistance. If you remember, were also some of the biggest declines for the employment as well. The last thing that I wanted to share here, this is the Back to Normal Index. Moody's Analytics and CNN Business have partnered on this, and they're looking at a bunch of different factors, a lot of them national, and then some of them state level, to provide an index for each state representing the economy relative to March. Maine's at about 86% right now. We're down a little bit. If you look at that line graph that's in there, you can see we were close to 100% for a while. We're in 12th place. We had been first for a couple of months. And there are a couple things that are going on as we've seen unemployment start to pick back up. I think there's a big seasonality factor that isn't being really accounted for very well in this index. And so as we're sort of coming into our quieter season, we're starting to fall back. But of course, we've also seen coronavirus cases increasing again. While we are better than much of the nation still on that count, it has been starting to tick up. And so that's reflected in this as well. I think that's the last thought that I want to share before maybe we have time for a couple more questions. But really the thing that we have learned the most this year is that public health and economic health are intertwined, and we're not going to have a robust economy until we can have robust public health again. People need to feel safe and secure going about their days, not just in an economic fashion, but also in a physical fashion. So they need to make sure that they feel safe and healthy and able to go out and go to their job and send their kids to school and participate in the economy before we're able to sort of return back to normal. Now, hopefully the vaccine is sending us down the right path there, and the end hopefully is in sight, but we do still have a ways to go before we're back there. And that's my contact information. I think that was in the bio that was shared with everybody as well. So if you have questions down the line, you can reach out. You can also certainly reach out through, I'm part of the Department of Administrative and Financial Services. Anya Trundy is our legislative liaison. So you don't have to remember my contact information. You can go ahead and reach out through her, and she is happy to connect you with me. So I apologize for sort of racing through a whole bunch of charts all at once. I'm sure that we'll make sure to get these circulated to you so you can peruse them at a slightly more leisurely pace down the line. But hopefully I can answer any last questions you may have before we wrap up for the morning. Julie, do you want to help navigate questions?
Yeah, I see one in the chat from Senator Brenner. She's just saying that she doesn't see much about farming, fishing, and logging. She's wondering, if they're part of natural resources, and are they not?
Yeah, one of the challenges with that particular sector on the employment side is that the best employment data we have comes from the unemployment insurance program, which does not include a lot of the farming and fishing programs. So it's really hard to get good employment data specifically on those. They're captured a little bit better in some of the GDP data, but the natural resources industries are some of the hardest to get really good numbers on.
Amanda, this is Yellow. I think too, some of the biggest parts of that are captured under other headings. So the paper mills might be captured under manufacturing.
Yeah.
Whereas the actual loggers might be captured under the ag and forestry segment. So to get a perspective on a sector, you often have to pull from different parts of the raw economic classifications that Amanda's been.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
I don't see any other questions in the chat or anyone's hand raised. So,
all right. I stunned everyone with my rapid fire data. Well, thank you all very much for your attention this morning. I really appreciate it. And certainly if there are questions that come up down the line, you'll be able to find me one way or another.
Thanks, everyone. I know this has been a long session. A special thanks to Amanda, who always covers an amazing amount of ground. And if you have other questions, we'll see if there's any in the chat and or email any one of us, and we may be able to circle back either in writing or even at the beginning of Friday's session. So, you know, use Amanda and us as resources. I would say in terms of cheat codes that, I don't know if you mentioned this, Amanda, but you usually put up a monthly economic indicators snapshot, I think around the first week of each month.
Right, yeah, I didn't mention that. We do on our website, we post a monthly economic indicators report. It's usually, we wait until the end of the month to get all of the data in that we can. So it's usually right around the beginning of the, you know, we'll have November's was posted right around the beginning of December, is a sort of the way that that works. And that gives a good mix of some of the longer term data trends that I mentioned, but also some other, we try to, if there's anything particularly timely, include that in there as well.
And the other, you know, cheat code that I find is that the Center for Workforce Research at the Maine Department of Labor has an awesome dashboard. Even a dummy like me can actually click a single button and download their dashboard to a PowerPoint slide automatically. So if you're going out to a Rotary or whatever and saying, hey, I want some employment figures or unemployment figures on a quick visual, boom, Center for Workforce Research. Center for Workforce Research over at Maine Department of Labor has a really user-friendly dashboard. So those are just a few cheat codes if you're looking to get most up to date. So let me just check the chat one last time and then we'll wrap up. All right, great. You know, thanks again to Amanda. Thanks to Julie and Mike for putting this together.
Then they sign it. Yeah, they scan it. They scan it and then they send it.
Oh, if you're not mute, thank you. I was going to say, if you're not muted, thank you again to our partners, especially Maine Health Access Foundation and Maine Community Foundation that really make this all possible. Please join us whenever you can on Friday and in January. Please take advantage of the videos of those sessions. Please let us know how else we can help. And please refer your colleagues. I was looking at the participant list, and while you may have been multitasking this morning, almost everyone who signed on stayed with us for the duration, which is an impressive commitment. Thank you for your service to Maine. And I see the Senate President is still with us. I'm amazed, Troy, given your schedule. I don't know if you had any final thoughts for the group as we break here.
No, I mean, you know, once again, I just know that this is obviously even more critical at this point. So I just want to thank you for your work. Really appreciate it, man. And that was very informative. I'm looking forward to maybe getting some of the hard copy to go over that again, but very informative. And, you know, definitely looking forward to working with you in the future on what we can do to put people back on track. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. And per the questions in the chat, pretty much 100% of Friday will be about proposed solutions. And so too will be the 3 sessions in January on talent, innovation, and infrastructure. There'll be people either working directly on the solutions or living it on the front lines. So that's why we looked at this as kind of foundation setting for that. So hopefully the pieces are complementary to one another. And I think talking to Josh Broder and Lori LaChance, I think they were counting on us to do this piece so they could focus on the recommendations. Julie, anything I'm missing? Oh, Julie has an evaluation tool that really quick hitting assessment that helps us know where we hit the mark or any suggestions for improvement you have. She'll email that out. I think, Julie, can you stick that in the chat right as we're closing too?
I can't put it in this chat.
So
I don't have the link yet, but I will include it in the follow-up email that will have some other resources as well.
Please give us feedback. It helps us make each session even better for you all. And frankly, even to know what works helps us repeat it again next time. Thank you so much. Have a great day and a great holiday if we don't see you on Friday.
Thank you.